What actually protects political freedom? Is it good leaders? Strong laws? A wise constitution? Or is freedom something more fragile? Something that must be carefully engineered into the structure of power itself? In the 21st century, we often debate political polarization, the power of institutions, the independence of courts, and the limits of executive authority. Across democracies, we hear the same concerns. Are institutions strong enough? Can power concentrate too easily? These questions are not new. In 1748, the French political thinker Montesquieu published a monumental work titled The Spirit of the Laws. It would become one of the most influential books in the history of political thought. Montesquieu was not simply asking what laws should exist. He was asking a deeper question. Why do laws take the form they do? And how should political systems be structured so that liberty can survive? Today, we will explore why this 18th century book still matters. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, was born in 1689 in France, during the age of absolute monarchy. France was ruled by kings whose authority was vast, centralized, and only weakly constrained by institutions. The memory of Louis XIV still dominated French political life. The famous phrase often attributed to him, "I am the state," captured the essence of the political order, sovereignty concentrated in a single ruler. But by the early 18th century, Europe was changing. Scientific thinking was transforming how people understood nature. Philosophers of the Enlightenment were questioning inherited authority. Commerce was expanding. Montesquieu himself was a nobleman, a magistrate, and a careful observer of political systems. He traveled widely across Europe and studied different legal traditions, cultures, and institutions. What fascinated him most was comparison. Why did different countries develop different laws? Why were some societies free, while others were despotic? These questions would lead Montesquieu to spend nearly 20 years developing The Spirit of the Laws, a vast analysis of political systems, legal structures, economics, culture, climate, religion, and social norms. At the time, the book was revolutionary. It suggested that laws were not arbitrary commands imposed by rulers, but part of a complex system shaped by society itself. The central problem Montesquieu confronts is the problem of political power. Specifically, how can power exist without destroying liberty? All governments require authority. Laws must be enforced. Decisions must be made. Yet, the very existence of power creates a danger. Power tends to expand. Rulers seek greater authority. Institutions accumulate control. And when power becomes concentrated, liberty disappears. Montesquieu famously observed that any person who holds power is inclined to abuse it. This insight was not merely psychological, it was structural. It meant that freedom cannot depend on the goodwill of rulers. Instead, freedom must be protected by the structure of government itself. For Montesquieu, the challenge was therefore institutional design, how to arrange power so that no single authority could dominate. Montesquieu begins with a striking claim. Laws are not universal formulas that can be imposed identically everywhere. Instead, laws arise from the relations within a society, its geography, economy, customs, religion, and social structure. A law that works well in one country might fail in another. For example, commercial societies often develop different legal frameworks than agricultural societies. Large empires require different administrative systems than small republics. This insight seems obvious today, but in the 18th century, it challenged the belief that rulers could simply design perfect legal systems from abstract principles. Montesquieu argued that good laws must correspond to the spirit of a society. Montesquieu classified governments into three broad types: republics, monarchies, and despotisms. Each operates according to a different principle. Republics depend on civic virtue, a commitment by citizens to place the public good above private interest. Monarchies operate through honor and hierarchical loyalty. Despotisms rely primarily on fear. These principles matter because they sustain the political system itself. If the underlying principle collapses, the regime becomes unstable. For example, a republic in which citizens lose civic virtue may slowly transform into oligarchy or authoritarian rule. Perhaps the most famous idea in the spirit of the laws is the separation of powers. Montesquieu argued that liberty requires the division of political authority into distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. If these powers are concentrated in the same hands, freedom is impossible. Why? Because the same authority would be making the laws, enforcing them, and judging violations of them. That combination creates irresistible opportunities for abuse. By contrast, when power is divided among separate institutions, each branch can limit the others. This mutual restraint creates a balance that protects citizens from arbitrary rule. This concept would profoundly influence the framers of the United States Constitution and later democratic systems around the world. Montesquieu consistently emphasized moderation. He distrusted extreme concentrations of authority and radical political experiments. Instead, he believed stable governments emerge from balanced institutions that limit excess. Political liberty does not mean unlimited freedom. Rather, it means security, the assurance that citizens will not be arbitrarily punished or dominated by rulers. Moderation therefore requires laws that are predictable, institutions that are stable, and governments that operate within clear limits. Another important insight in the book is that liberty should not rely on the character of individual rulers. Even a wise and benevolent leader cannot guarantee long-term freedom. Leaders change, circumstances change, power corrupts. The only reliable safeguard is institutional design. If the structure of government forces different powers to check each other, liberty can survive even when individuals are flawed. This idea marks a major shift in political thinking, from the search for ideal rulers to the design of durable systems. Why does a book written in 1748 still matter today? Because the problems Montesquieu studied have not disappeared. Across modern democracies, we continue to debate the same fundamental questions: the independence of courts, the authority of legislatures, the limits of executive power. Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers remains a cornerstone of constitutional design. Whenever courts review government decisions, whenever legislatures investigate executive actions, whenever constitutions limit political authority, we see the influence of Montesquieu's ideas. But his insights extend beyond formal institutions. He also reminds us that political systems depend on culture. A republic requires citizens who respect laws and participate in public life. If civic virtue declines, institutions alone may struggle to preserve liberty. In the age of mass media, digital information, and global political polarization, this question becomes especially relevant. Can democratic systems maintain the cultural foundations that support them? Montesquieu would likely argue that institutional design and social norms must reinforce one another. Finally, his emphasis on moderation is strikingly relevant in an era of ideological extremes. Stable political systems rarely survive when power becomes concentrated or when institutions are undermined in pursuit of short-term advantage. The architecture of liberty depends on patience, restraint, and balance. Like any major work of political theory, the spirit of the laws is not without its critics. Some scholars argue that Montesquieu occasionally overemphasized environmental factors such as climate when explaining political differences between societies. These arguments, sometimes called climate determinism, are controversial today. Others note that Montesquieu's classification of governments is somewhat simplified. Real political systems often combine elements of multiple forms. There are also debates about whether he idealized the English constitutional system he admired. Yet, despite these limitations, the strengths of the work remain remarkable. Montesquieu pioneered comparative political analysis. Instead of describing one ideal state, he studied many societies and attempted to understand the conditions that shaped them. This approach laid foundations for modern political science. The book is also frequently misunderstood as advocating rigid institutional formulas. In reality, Montesquieu emphasized flexibility and adaptation. Laws must correspond to the character and circumstances of each society. His deeper lesson is not a specific blueprint, but a method. Analyze power carefully, distribute it wisely, and design institutions that prevent domination. More than 2.5 centuries after its publication, the spirit of the laws continues to shape how we think about freedom. Montesquieu did not believe liberty could be secured through optimism about human nature. Instead, he assumed something more realistic. Power will always seek expansion. The challenge, therefore, is not to eliminate power, but to arrange it so that it restrains itself. Liberty survives not because rulers are perfect, but because institutions make domination difficult. In an age where political systems around the world face new pressures, technological, economic, and ideological, Montesquieu's insight remains profoundly relevant. Freedom is not automatic. It is an achievement of careful design. And perhaps the most important question we can still ask today is the one Montesquieu asked in 1748. If power naturally grows, what structures are strong enough to contain it?